Sports, brought to you by our sponsor, the American Arbitration Association, longtime sponsor of the Sports Lawyers Association. Very happy today to introduce our guest, Nona Lee, former president of the Sports Lawyers Association, and now the founder and CEO of Truth DEI Consulting. Welcome, Nona.
Thanks, Bobby. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And I always enjoy a good conversation with you. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, this is great. It's really exciting. And the way we like to start out the show is to talk a little bit about your current venture and your path, because I think it makes for a really terrific story.
Well, I'm happy to share. So what I'm doing now is in April, when I resigned from my position as Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer with the Diamondbacks, after 22 years, I launched Truth DEI Consulting virtually, the same day. And, my mission is really to help businesses find their DEI truth. And we do that in a number of ways. We basically provide services from soup to nuts. So we do CEO, one-on-one CEO coaching. We do leadership, team education, organization-wide education. We also do assessments and assistance with DEI strategic planning for organizations. And I also do a fair amount of keynote speaking just on topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, I love it. And as much as I loved my career in sports and my job at the Arizona Diamondbacks, I started doing this work at the Diamondbacks in 2020, leading the D-Backs for Change initiative, and absolutely fell in love with the work. And decided to go get my diversity, equity, inclusion credentials from Cornell, and did that as I was leading the effort, and really fell in love with the work, and decided that, after having some health issues and stuff, it makes you evaluate your life and what value you're adding to the world. And I decided that this is the way I wanted to give back and add value to the world, and hopefully leave it, a better place than I found it.
Well, I think it's always important, talking about the concept of giving back, which I think is one of the things that you learn either because you weren't raised by wolves, or you came across a point in life where you realized, I'm a lucky person, and what can I share? But before you did this, collegiate athlete, law school, sports, talk a little bit about that, and then we're going to get into the DEI. But I think it's really interesting because oftentimes, especially for the students and the young lawyers that watch this, they're going through life with blinders on, and they're thinking, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to do. But if they look to the right, they might find that perfect place. And, you did something for a very long time, and you swiveled your head and said, wait a second, this is really what sings to me.
Yeah, and it's not my first time making that type of pivot, frankly. And that's how I got into sports, is litigating and the WNBA starting, and just thinking I have to merge my passion for sports with my practice, which I also love. And that's how I got in sports, which I absolutely loved. And sports has been my home my whole life, from the time I was a small child. And that's where I found all those intangible life skills that help you be successful, right? Willingness to take risks, discipline, determination, teamwork. And all of that lent itself to my studies and to my career, and to helping me be successful. But, look, I started out competitively as a AAU swimmer and water polo player, and learned so many lessons through that, some of which I talk about in the context of DEI, including making the team and half the team quitting. And not showing up the next day because parents didn't want them in the pool with me. Then having the opportunity to play basketball in college at Pepperdine, and having a complete opposite experience of inclusion in a way that I had hoped to find out in the work world, right? And that wasn't necessarily the case for me. And in terms of my path, my mom was a legal secretary. I grew up working in law firms a lot, and I did not like lawyers. So it was so I was really reluctant to become one. And it took me a few years. So I tested the water first as a paralegal. And he kicked me out after 3 years. and said, you're doing everything but going to court, you're going to law school. And so it was a very last minute decision, not well planned. Did only apply to the one law school whose application deadline was still open, and did well there and came out of law school as a litigator. But then realized again, as I said, that my passion, you don't always know it's there until you're exposed to it, right? Because in my day in law school, I didn't know anything about opportunities to work as a lawyer in sports, and it has changed so much as the business has expanded tremendously. And it certainly expanded over the 20 years that I worked in it, starting with working with the Suns and Diamondbacks when they were jointly owned back in 2000, and ultimately when they were sold to different owners, moving down to the Diamondbacks to start their first dedicated in-house legal department in 2005. And it was a great ride. And one of the questions I get asked the most is, do you miss it? And yeah, I do miss it. I do miss it in terms of being in that environment every day. And I work with some great people, but I know I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing right now. And there's no question in my mind. And although I'm not working in sports full time, my goal is really to do this work in sports as I was doing with the Diamondbacks, and they're still, one of my clients, because there's a big need for this work. Well, many industries, but I know there's a need for it in sports because that's where I've spent the last 22 years.
And also, you mentioned you started as a litigator, and it seems to be a common theme in this program, especially for people who say, well, why didn't you start just as a transactional lawyer if that's what you ended up doing? And again, we all start where we start, but I am an advocate for spending a couple of years of your life when you start out as a litigator, because I believe it makes you a better transactional lawyer and a better deal maker. I think people find that the education you get litigating is so different from anything else you might do.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I don't think it's a traditional path to get into sports, but, as I always say, it doesn't hurt the running none. It's really helped me and informed the way that I draft contracts, the way I think about deals, because I think about it from a litigator's perspective in terms of what can happen on the back end, which is really helpful, in terms of issue spotting and drafting to mitigate risk. So that litigation experience has been tremendously helpful with the transactional part of the practice, but also, when you're in house and you're the general counsel or chief legal officer, whatever it is, you're also overseeing all the litigation being handled by outside counsel. So it's really helpful to have that background because you understand what it is they need, what they're thinking, the direction things need to go in. So it's tremendously helpful.
I think my favorite thing about being an in-house counsel was speaking to litigators and saying something to them where they realize, oh shit, he knows what he's talking about.
Exactly.
He actually must have done this before. Exactly. And then all of a sudden the conversation becomes very different because you can just get into the strategy. Where do you leverage? Where are the touch points, which you learn as a litigator, which I think just makes you so much better of a transactional sort of lawyer, a deal maker.
Mm-hmm. Well, it helps the organization more broadly too, because when you have that background trying to go explain the risk of proceeding with litigation or why it's important you do so, without that background, it's a little bit more challenging to explain that in a way. I think that it can be as impactful sometimes.
And you mentioned something earlier about, starting in the program you started at the Diamondbacks in 2020. And I don't know what it was about right around that time, but I really feel 2020, I don't know if it was pre-pandemic or really 2019, there seemed to be this final seismic shift of awareness of that. And I know just the SLA, we had a moment when you were president that changed the whole approach that we as an organization have. Because fundamentally, I think everybody says, well, we should be doing this and thinks they're doing it. But I think we've learned that, and I mean, it's your world now, but unless you're focused and deliberative, you're not really doing DE&I.
It requires intention and generally requires transformation And it requires some uncomfortable conversations, sometimes some uncomfortable and difficult decisions, because otherwise it's a status quo. Things don't change. And so, and it takes strategy. You can't just say, well, we're going to do this and think you're doing DEI. And, often I'll have people who say, well, we're diverse because we have women. Well, that's great. That's a good starting point, but there are many dimensions of diversity. And so are you truly diverse and inclusive? No, I mean, it's really about embracing all dimensions and aspects of diversity, and not just in terms of having people there, but creating an inclusive culture where they feel, respected and valued and have that sense of belonging. And that takes more than just saying, okay, we're going to hire, diverse talent, because often they don't stay. And that's something I hear often as well. We bring people in, but they don't stay. Well, what have you done to shift your culture? Which was previous a culture where there was no diversity. How can that be comfortable, for people from a diverse background? What is there in that makes them feel they're welcome and that they want to be there and stay there and that their contributions are valued? Or one of the most challenging things is, often you look at leadership teams and you see no one who looks like you. So what are the possibilities of ever getting there? And so for people who aspire to rise to the top of an organization, looking at organizations who have that sort of framework or makeup can be discouraging. And, a lot of people don't realize that. And, it's important to have diversity for a number of reasons, but one of them is if you want diverse talent and if you want communities of color to support you, they need to see that you support them and that there are people from their community in decision-making roles.
And that's the big issue to me in sports, where you have many leagues that are majority diverse talent pools, but the management may not be. And I know we've seen some change in that over the years. And you come from a place where there weren't a lot of women in management in Major League Baseball, and there certainly weren't people of color, and there certainly weren't people in the LGBTQ community. Finally, it's a trickle, I think. I mean, you look at the NFL, and they've had this rule about coaching that, yell at me, NFL people, has the Rooney Rule ever really been utilized? Doesn't look like it to me. It was an effort, but the intentionality seems missing. Do you see that the leagues are starting to be more intentional about trying to put people in these positions in management to sort of parallel to some degree their player talent pools?
I think there's more of an awareness and there's an interest in doing it. And, the question is, how do you go about that? Because, frankly, Bobby, it requires more than intentionality. It requires accountability. And that's why rules like the Rooney Rule and the Selig rule don't always work as compared to, for example, the Mansfield Rule for lawyers and, in-house departments and law firms, which actually has accountability and helps you with a strategy for how to accomplish that kind of change. And so I don't know that those rules are ever going to work. I mean, they were certainly, what's the word I'm looking for? They were inspirational. But if there's no teeth to it, are you really going to get people to follow it? And that's one of the things that's really required for transformative change in leadership or throughout organizations is accountability, in addition to that intentionality. In other words, holding in particular, first of all, making sure your leadership team is on board and there's complete buy-in at the top, and then putting accountability with reaching diversity, equity, and inclusion goals and targets, and setting that strategy and having people have skin in the game. And that isn't always to say that, a lot of leaders are afraid that they're going to get dinged economically if they don't hit a diversity goal. Well, maybe it's a bonus thing. I mean, but there are ways to ingrain accountability in the process that actually makes change happen.
So part of what you're doing now with your new enterprise with Truth DEI Consulting, do you find yourself I mean, what's, is it an upside down pyramid? Which way does the pyramid go? Do you say to them, where is your strategic plan that addresses this? Or, I mean, what's the relationship between the strategic plan and getting a DE&I plan? How are they married? Because I think they have to go together.
Ultimately, they do. And so, usually, I simply start with asking people where they are. What have they done? Do they have a plan? What is their vision and mission? What are they willing to do? Because, the reality is I wish everybody were ready for 100% transformative change, but everyone isn't. But, for example, starting with education is a great start because at least people can develop an understanding and people can begin to speak the same language around diversity, equity, and inclusion and start to think strategically about it. But yes, I mean, ultimately, every organization should have a strategic plan that, that is focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion as a core business value, because it should be. So often when you're, for example, doing it mid-year, as we did at the Diamondbacks, it's a separate diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. But ideally, what happens is that diversity, equity, and inclusion is built into the strategic plan for your business because it is a part of your business strategy.
So you now go into whether they're sports clients or non-sports clients. Are you generally finding that the people that you're working with don't know what's going on, know that they have to do something? I mean, what's the range? Because it's such sort of a new reality, I think, that's being focused on in the business world, that there are probably some people that say we have to do this and other people that saying we want to do this. This is important for our business plan. What's the communication strategy to help these people realize it's just the right thing to do?
It's a great question, Bobby. And, frankly, I get the entire range. And not everyone's going to do it because it's the right thing to do. If that were the case, it would have been done long ago because it's been the right thing to do forever, and certainly legally since 1964 at least, right? So yeah, so it what has changed that is really helpful, because I'm a hearts and mind person with this stuff, because it is the right thing to do and I want to touch people there. But I also recognize and talked about people about that it's no longer just the right thing to do. This is a business imperative. And frankly, as a lawyer, it's a risk management strategy, because if you do DE&I right, you don't really have to worry as much about discrimination claims and harassment claims, because people are treating each other respectfully and equitably. But it's really a business imperative in this changing world because, research has shown, so it's real, that, and we all know it, right? Demographics are changing. Baby boomers, Gen Jones, all of us, we're phasing out. Gen X is coming up, but I forget if it's 2025 or 2040, millennials are going to make up 75% of the workforce, 75%. And their values are very different than ours in terms of they want to work for organizations that share their values. And one of their top values is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they are so quick, them and Gen Z, to swipe left, even with top organizations, if their values don't align with their personal values. And so demographics are quickly changing. The buying power of our consumers are quickly changing. And it's shifting with that change in strategy, not just generationally, but soon minorities are going to be the majority in the company. And, consumer buying power is shifting in the same way. So it's going to be significant. And so businesses that don't understand this and begin to shift in that direction now and embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion very well could get left behind, certainly may have difficulty hiring and retaining top talent, but also may suffer economically if consumers don't support them because their values aren't aligned and if businesses aren't also supporting diverse communities.
It's really interesting. I think we've come in the last 2 or 3 years, that those words tend to roll off people's tongues: diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they say, oh, people think they know what it means. People have a sense that it means bringing, everybody to the table, et cetera. But you were just talking and you used what I think is a critically important word that has to be addressed in the DE&I context, and that's harassment. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about that and how that plays in, because I think that's oftentimes overlooked in the context of trying to make things right.
Yeah, part of the education with diversity, equity, and inclusion also talks about what I call the disruptors. Diversity, equity, inclusion, which are bias, whether intentional or unconscious, and most of the bias that people engage in often is unconscious, and there are many, many different types. Also, microaggressions, right? And that type of bias and microaggressions, such as gaslighting, et cetera, they're a form of harassment, honestly. So they are very much tied together. And that's why I said earlier that diversity, equity, inclusion, in my view as a lawyer, is also a form of risk management. It's a risk management strategy, because if you can get your employees to understand diversity, equity, inclusion, and educate them in the disruptors and teach them how to be allies to one another, then you're less likely to have to deal with harassment claims or discrimination claims from managers, et cetera. And it will, because you have a much more inclusive workplace where everybody feels comfortable.
Yeah. Are you finding that your clients are willing to engage in company-wide training programs? And I ask because I know I've been through the training program that we did for the SLA board, and it was extraordinary. It was, truly impactful. And I think you can't establish a policy without having a process. And I think that educational process is so important. So are you finding people willing to engage in extended some period of an educational process as part of, developing a structure?
Absolutely, because they understand generally that in order to truly embrace it, everybody needs to understand it. And the only way to understand it is to educate them and to talk about it and let them engage and ask questions and participate in exercises. Because if you can't do that, how are people supposed to understand? How are they supposed to get on board and embrace it? And so, one of the things I always tell people and talk about is that it really does require getting comfortable with being a little uncomfortable, because these conversations, even in the context of education, can be very difficult to have, but they're so worthwhile, and the discomfort's not going to be there forever. With the learning, that goes away because you're armed with it. I know often we get afraid of making mistakes because it requires ongoing learning, right? But mistakes aren't fatal. Learning from them and learning how to address them are. And so education is key. And, I have some clients that do more abbreviated sessions who are down the road in diversity, equity, inclusion. For example, last week I just did one, a live education session on the disruptors and allyship. Whereas I have another client that I'm doing, a series of 1 hour sessions on diversity, equity, inclusion, on bias, on privilege, on allyship, and, allyship and beyond. And, helping them make a personal commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. So it takes different forms depending on how far down the road the company is and, the timing in which they can do it. But it's always valuable. And whatever you can do is better than doing nothing, right? And you have to start.
So when you're doing with your work, are you dealing mostly, is this C-suite? Is this HR? Is it C-suite directing HR to start talking with you and coordinating? How does this process really get underway?
Yeah, it's a combination, sometimes it has come from the president and CEO saying, I know we need to do this. And, I'm not an expert in this. I know I need your help. And other times it comes from the middle that says we have the charge to do this as an organization, but we don't really feel that we have complete buy-in from the top. And so we need your help doing that. having those conversations. But so it could come from any place. It doesn't always come through HR. Often, more and more organizations have diversity, equity, and inclusion committees now if they don't have a DEI professional. And often it comes from them saying, here's what we've done so far, but we really need your help, and we want to do more company-wide education and, be sure that we can get everybody at the leadership level engaged, because they recognize that, if leadership isn't 100% engaged and beyond just buy-in, but participating, and the people at the middle and the bottom feel like it's performative and it loses credibility. They don't think it's real, that it matters to the organization. So it really does require 100% authentic buy-in at the top if it's going to be truly successful.
I think that's so true of business in general, that unless you get buy-in at the top, people below looking up and seeing that the top's not buying in, I think it's just human nature to say, oh, well, if the boss isn't in on this, why does it matter? When the boss says we're taking that hill and leads from the front, sort of the people behind go, yeah, I'm with you. And that's a really interesting dynamic to have to find, to get that head of a company, that president, that leader of a division or whatever, to actually say, we're doing this again because it's the right thing to do, because it's difficult. I mean, there are some people who would just get it, right? And I still think there are people out there who need a little gentle push maybe to realize the value in learning about this stuff.
There are, frankly, and that's why, part of my strategy is I recognize I have to meet people where they are. And I acknowledge that everybody's not ready for 100% transformative change and what that requires. And so let's talk about what we can do to get you started. And generally it continues to move on from there. And ultimately you get get them into transformative change. But, people are people. And, some people are interested in the right things. Some people are interested in the business outcome, the business benefits of diversity, equity, inclusion. And that's okay too, because I will continue to work on the hard part of it, right? Because it does matter. It will always matter. And, when I'm speaking or when I'm doing a training, I start with 2 questions. And the first one is, have you ever in your lives been dismissed or rejected because of the color of your skin, your sexual orientation, your gender, your religion, your abilities, maybe? And quite a few people raise their hands. And I ask them to think about what that feels like. What that felt like to them when it happens. And then the next question is, have you ever dismissed or rejected anyone based on those characteristics? And I raise my hand because I prefer not to, but it's part of that natural human response called the bias that creeps in. And what's important is to acknowledge that you have them, identify them, manage them with a view towards eventually eliminating. But we can't start with our truth and acknowledge that we have biases and that we need to learn more about, this DEI thing, and learn more about other people and learn to see the humanity in people, which is the H in the truth. Then, it's going to be difficult to get to that place that we're all trying to get to, that mountaintop of a completely inclusive culture. But, that's what I'm in it for. And I really hope that I can get some people there and, help make the workplace better and more inclusive for everybody, because that wasn't always my experience. And I really want to see that happen for other people.
Well, Nona, this has been great. And I could sit here for hours talking about this with you on so many levels, but, I think you have the right name for your business, because the truth is that we need to make the world more inclusive, because it serves everyone's interests and it raises everyone's lives. And I've seen what you've done professionally in your career leading up to this point, and the challenges and the hurdles you've overcome and the leadership positions you've taken. And you've now turned to, I hate to say this, but a higher truth, than just getting the job done. And more of this is going to be just part of our common language as we're dealing with it. And like many things, let's stop worrying about that it's taken so long to get to a point. Let's just remind people we got work to do, and let's get there a little quicker. And thank you for not giving up the fight. Thank you for pushing forward on this issue. It makes all of us the better for it. So thank you for being the guest today. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. And I wish you nothing but the best, because I know you'll have great success at it. And more importantly, I'm happy that you're on the right side of history.
Thank you so much, Bobby. It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and we can continue offline anytime.
All right, my friend. Thanks
All
for
right.
joining us. We'll see you all in 2 weeks for episode 47 of Sports Shorts. Everybody have a great day. See you soon. Oh, and by the way, don't forget to renew your membership to the SLA. We're on a calendar renewal, so it's time to go on site. There's a little tab that tells you to renew on the sportslaw.org website. So please renew your membership. And I look forward to seeing you in May at our live and in-person annual conference in Los Angeles, California.